The teaser trailer for Scorn was released on the 29th of June 2016. For the vast majority of people, it was the introduction to the game, as the previous attempt at getting it off the ground, an initial Kickstarter attempt with a pre-alpha trailer, failed to garner interest. The trailer is, in essence, a disjointed series of disconnected things. Biological structures, Geigeryan architecture, but none of it really tells you what the game is going to be about, how the gameplay will be like, or even what all this stuff is in terms of the larger picture. However, along with the trailer, the developers have also released a bunch of concept art for the game, and a lot of this concept art seems to match up very well with what's presented in the trailer, to the point where for most of the trailer you have an accompanying bit of concept art to cross-compare the final product that'll be in the game and the initial idea that spawned it. So I'm going to be going through the trailer and then talking about how it relates to the accompanying concept art. Let's begin. Not exactly off to a good start. The trailer opens up with a close-up shot of some biological thing that has no concept art to go with it. In fact, I'm not even sure what it's supposed to be. However, it does transition into something that's a little bit more defined and does have some concept art accompanying it. What's presented are these pillars of flesh topped with some weird green biological matter. There are questions of, are they constructed or do they grow naturally? Are they a hazard to the Scorn people, or do they get use out of them, similar to how trees on Earth provide resources for us? We don't know, but there is concept for it all the same. And in the concept art, there's a few things that stand out as far as significant as far as I'm concerned. The first thing is that these pillars here are placed uniformly. They aren't scattered in random directions, but are spaced evenly from each other in neat rows. This to me implies they are there by design, placed in such a way for ease of access, similar to how we plant crops and even trees at times in specific patterns for our convenience. Another thing that sticks out is the background, specifically the top right. It doesn't resemble a sky or atmosphere, but instead jagged rocks, as if these things were grown underground or in a cave somewhere. It is possible that the background is just the artist's way of providing atmosphere, not actually indicative of its location, but I do find it interesting nonetheless. And just as a little bonus, it's actually possible to see that these are copy and pasted from each other, and then the artist went back and added some new details to the copy and pasted ones. It makes it easier to paint all these complex structures. The other concept art we have of them provides another bit of information. Their size. You can see Scorn guy on the bottom left there. Though I think the trailer does sort of invoke the feeling that these are large structures, this provides some very concrete context to just how large they are. The next shot in the trailer pans over some biological surface. It could be part of those meat pillars, it could be something different. There's no context to it, and I think this is just to show off the graphical detail in the game. But following that are more well-defined structures. Well-defined in the sense we can see them completely, not so much in the sense that we know what they are. It's a very similar shot to the meat pillars from before. a group of these strange biological structures inside some cloudy, possibly enclosed area. But unlike the previous one, these structures don't really have much rhyme or reason to them, at least as far as placement goes. They're all facing completely different directions, and perhaps that's something that cannot be controlled, but I would think that if they were planted there, like I think the meat pillars were, that the Scorn people would figure out some way to get them to pour out their biological exhaust in a specific direction. Unlike other things in the trailer, this not only has concept art, but also early models. On his ArtStation page, Bosko Vasovic calls this thing Fleshy Exhaust, and says it's an environment model for the Scorn game. What's interesting is that the other things Vasovic has posted in relation to Scorn are all from the pre-alpha version of the game, stuff you would have seen in the pre-alpha trailer. So not only does this imply that this flesh exhaust thing was a very early idea, but could also mean that we now know the area that it should appear in, which is an enclosed, presumably underground area. The only problem is the area in the pre-alpha trailer is brown, while the area that these things appear in the teaser trailer is very green, mainly due to the clouds around it, but green nonetheless. Though, on the other hand, concept art for the pre-alpha version of the game does tend to utilize a very green color palette for the backgrounds. As far as concept art goes, the Fleshy Exhaust doesn't have anything too substantial, just a series of 3 of these structures, likely for the developers to choose which one they like best or which features on them they like best and incorporate it into the game. It's not uncommon at all for concept artists to draw variations of something for the developers to pick and choose from. From what I can see, the final product seems to be based mostly on the middle one. Following that is a shot of a biological surface with meat of unknown function being encased in a sort of rib cage-like surrounding. Whatever it is, it's certainly alive. You can see the flesh pulsate underneath the bone in a rhythmic breathing pattern. I don't know if this is supposed to be like the close-up of some creature's chest, or maybe a surface you traverse across, or part of a wall. The concept art for it doesn't give the context, but it does provide some new information. Missing from the trailer is the bottom part of the structure, with some tentacle or umbilical cord stretching out from within it into some unknown area. Very different from the trailer, in the center is the outline of a very vaguely humanoid figure. The pattern the bones take is different, having a much more pronounced T-shape in the concept art, and topping it all is this additional structure that, well, I have no idea what it is or what it does. The next shot in the trailer is just a close-up of the Fleshy Exhaust, another showcase of how good the graphics of the game is supposed to be. Taking a break from all the environments, it then shows some creature incubating, perhaps inside a translucent red pod. It certainly looks threatening, but at the moment it's simply sleeping and we don't know how it will wake up. What it's being held in looks a lot more artificial than anything we've seen in the trailer so far, which could indicate that these things are grown or bred by Scorn people or some other civilization for some unknown purpose. Whatever they are, it seems beneficial to them to have massive quantities of fat wrapping around their neck and shoulders, to have very tiny hands that would rival some presidents, to have no lips but instead its face being built in layers, the topmost layer being its forehead, followed by the eyes, and carved out beneath that in a way that would also incorporate a set of nostrils, its mouth. A mouth with long, jagged, unkempt teeth. Is this a friend? Is it a foe? Will it help us on our adventures, or will we have to face off against it? We don't have complete concept art for it, but we do have some very telling concept art. For a development team so concerned about spoilers, they didn't leave the fate of this guy to the imagination. At some point in time, we should expect to see this guy decapitated, or partially so. We can see that he has a very different flesh structure than what we have on Earth, made up of globs of meaty substances rather than any defined structure like a brain or intestines or heart. We can see just how round this guy is at the head, something that can only be partially discerned from the trailer if you really pay attention to the far left side of his appearance. And his body seems to have multiple different holes in it, now leaking out some blood-like fluid. It's unknown if these holes were made by the same event that led to its death, or if it's part of his structure. I couldn't see any in the actual appearance in the trailer, but they do look fairly uniform, having a set of 3 on each flab of its body. This bit of concept art was actually posted as a GIF. It shows the creature decaying over time. We have seen creatures decay in Scorn before, not just in concept art, but also in the game demo, where multitudes of husks of those bears that seem to plague the facility you walk through can be found in broken pieces among the piles of red flesh that they seem to create. Over time, the body just sort of breaks down and cracks open, more similar, I would say, to porcelain than to actual flesh. It looks like it hardens over time as well, and the way it cracks makes this sort of grid-like structure that is very similar to the sort of structures you would see in a Beksinski painting. And then eventually it breaks down so much that it's not even recognizable as the thing it once was, resembling coral more than anything. And when I say it breaks down in a grid-like pattern, it really does. And the buildings of the Scorn world also break down in a very similar way, blurring further the difference between biology and technology in this biomechanical hellhole. And yes, Scorn Guy decays in very much the same way. The following shot is of another biological structure, though if you look at the very bottom you can see what seems to be a metal slab with holes in it. Rising up from there is a smaller, or should I say thinner, structure that's made up of a slightly different, more wooden looking material than before, and is capped by a bunch of red veins running through it. There's no context to this, nor is there any concept art of it. I really have no idea what we're looking at. But the next shot is something that actually has a lot of meaning to it. It's Scorn Guy, or a Scorn Guy, waking up in a wall of flesh. To the left of him you can see some sort of umbilical cord attached to the flesh wall. It's possible to see an eye and his nose, but not his mouth. However, given how the flesh seems to wrap around his face, it could be covering up what would be his mouth. One is also able to see his exposed shoulders, which, if you recall pretty much every other bit of concept art of Scorn guys, they seem to be wearing some sort of fleshy suit that wraps around their neck and shoulders. This led me to believe that this is the earliest version of Scorn guy we will see in the game. This is where Scorn guy would be born, perhaps, where he would first develop. And guess what? Yeah, I was right. I guessed correctly. Here we can see a Scorn guy being formed in a wall of flesh. There are umbilical cords running off of him, similar to the umbilical cord seen in the shot previously. Right now this is a very undeveloped Scorn guy. He doesn't have his eyes and he doesn't have his nose, and his mouth isn't exactly a mouth as we can see. It has teeth-like structures, but is completely fused together. In fact, it doesn't even seem like he has a separate maxilla like human beings do. What is odd, however, is that he only seems to have 3 fingers, whereas Scorn guy clearly has 5 in the game. We don't see the hands of the Scorn guy forming in the wall in the trailer, but one does have to wonder if perhaps they start out with 3 fingers, if this Scorn guy might have a birth defect similar to what happens in human beings. And the concept art is a 2-parter, the second part likely not being what the developers intended people to find. There's a long-winded and amusing story about how I managed to acquire this concept art, but for now, let's just pay attention to the fact that eventually his eyes and nose did develop. The flesh wrapping around his face has encased more of what would be his mouth. His hand has repaired itself significantly more, losing the flesh tendrils between fingers, but not growing any additional ones. His skin around his, well, where his eyebrows would be, has also cleared up a bit. Now, there's a bit more to talk about with this concept art in the previous one, but we'll be getting back to that later. The trailer then transitions back to the previous structure, showing a different part of it. There's no additional context to it. I still have no idea what the hell this thing is. Whatever it is, it seems to deliver this blood-like substance to other parts of itself or some other machine. Who knows, it could be the Scorn version of a bong for all I know or care. And then it transitions back to this sleeping Scorn guy, turning his head into the wall and showing that he has an umbilical cord stemming from his back, presumably going to a different part of the flesh wall. And so odd too that they would break up a scene like this with something as nebulous as whatever it was they were showing. Like, this is a really important set of scenes here. It shows what the character should look like underneath the biological mask he's normally depicted with. It shows how these guys are formed. Why the gap in appearance? In any case, going back to the concept art, we can see that this Scorn guy does have an umbilical cord stemming from his back. He also has one stemming from his head and one stemming from his left shoulder. Now, things tend to change between concept art and what actually happens in the game. And we do not see the top part of the head in the trailer, meaning there very well could be some umbilical cords stemming from that, possibly feeding the character information that he would need to know in order to function in society, as I am of the opinion that Scorn guys are grown, fully developed, fully capable of whatever they need to do rather than needing to learn it over time like a human child. However, we can see his left shoulder in the trailer. It's the one facing the camera. We can see here that the cord doesn't even attach to any of the walls, nor does the one stemming from his head, or at least one part of it. In many ways, it actually resembles the umbilical cord that wraps around Scorn Guy's neck and has a little tentacle dangling down by his lungs that appears only when he's wearing that biological face mask. But still, that scene transition. Here's what it would look like if both different scenes were placed side by side rather than broken up by each other. The editing is a bit rough, yes, but I didn't exactly have a lot to work with there. Moving on. The next few shots focus in on a specific area, starting with the doors opening revealing Scorn Guy, a bird's eye view, a shot of the ground as he's walking forward, and finally a shot of his torso while carrying the gun. One of the important things about these shots is that shows the environment we're going through won't strictly be fleshy, but there will also be very obviously intelligently designed machinery. Machinery that very much looks like it's modeled after biology, but machinery all the same. We also get a decent silhouette of our player character, showing that he is in fact humanoid and not some strange octopus creature or xenomorph-like thing or anything like that. Yet, despite being humanoid, he is most certainly not human. He has no skin, his muscles are a very different structure than what can be found in humans. Over his shoulders are some thick patches of the closest thing to skin that we see on him. He has two very painful looking gashes on his chest, and on the top part of his chest are what looks like lungs, though that last one is a bit of a hindsight revelation from seeing them breathe in the demo. The concept art shows as much, though giving us a lot more detail and a frontal view rather than from the side. We see more of the top of it and are able to see the bony structure that wraps around his neck. We also see in the concept art these weird beads or tumors or whatever surrounding his lungs that are very clearly absent, not just in the model in the teaser trailer, but also the model used in the game demo and gameplay trailer. The gashes in his chest aren't always there, as indicated by another bit of concept art from the same angle shown in the trailer actually, where those gashes are completely missing. We're also able to see that the outfit he wears not just drapes over his shoulders, but also sort of runs down his back in this strange spinal formation. From the side view, it sort of looks like he's wearing a spacesuit actually. A fleshy, bony, horrific spacesuit, but one nonetheless. At least that's what it looks like to me. However, Scorn Guy is not the only important part of this shot. Front and center, mostly, is a gun he's holding. Now, this concept art of the gun doesn't really show anything new, other than perhaps there's supposed to be some additional attachment at the far end of the handle, but other than that, it looks pretty much the same as it does in the actual game. What's interesting is that in the trailer And in this concept art, you can see on the lower right part, there's a sort of forked prong at the end. But in the game demo, that prong is absent. So it might have undergone a bit of a revision, or perhaps there's a different model for the lower part. Who knows? A different and earlier concept of the gun, as indicated by the look of Scorn Guy's arm, showed that they originally intended for the gun to be attached to you. The attachment to the lower part of the handle would have been some tentacle that wraps around his arm, and stemming from some lower bit is a cord, perhaps some nerve-based cord, that digs deep into his arm. This idea, according to the head developer in an interview, had to be scrapped due to limitations of what they're able to do with the game. But I do wonder, where is that tentacle going? How long is it? How does the cord insert itself into him? This is where the trailer starts to make rapid cuts to and from different scenes, the first of which being this machine activating, extending two different arms that in turn lowers two different apparatuses. The concept art shows both a full view of the machine and shows how the arms are supposed to behave, or at least how they unwind themselves. It doesn't show what it does or how it does it, what you're supposed to place on those two slots down there, and how you're supposed to control the machine at all. Though, given what we know from the game demo, I am under the assumption that you're supposed to stick your arm in that hole on the left, and that's how you turn the thing on and activate it. Then it cuts back to a close-up of Scorn Guy's face behind a biological mask. It's worth pointing out both that this scene takes place in a different area than the one we've seen his body in, and also that his right eye is just slightly larger than his left. Due to the closeness of the shot, a few details are missed. His chin is not covered up by the gray structure that wraps around his mouth and the sides of his face, and that the right side of that structure is a bit bulkier and thicker than the left, and that he has a tentacle that wraps around his neck. The game version of the mask is a lot more red than the concept art, and obscures his face a lot more, in my opinion. Where the concept art you can clearly see not only his pupils, but also the structure of his eye. In the trailer, you're only able to see some white dots where his pupils would be. Given how this thing seems to so securely contain his face, I wonder if this is supposed to be like the Scorn version of a hazmat suit. Earlier I said that the outfit itself sort of resembles a spacesuit, but could be that that outfit along with this mask is actually the full body version of what Scorn people use when going through dangerous areas where breathing and interacting with certain things can be hazardous to their health. At least I assume it's for areas with stuff like poisonous gas or airborne deadly diseases, since the mask itself doesn't seem like it would be very protective if a projectile flew right into his face. We can see in earlier versions of the concept art that the things surrounding his face are going to be a lot more mechanical than biological, which does indicate that this mask is a construct of Scorn people and not some naturally occurring thing. We can also see that there was always going to be something wrapping around his neck, but what's interesting is that not only does it not have the little tentacle dangling down from it, but in the old version the lower part of his mouth is completely exposed to the elements. Another quick cut, and it's a first-person perspective of the character walking toward this massive machine with multitudes of large pipes stemming from it. The room itself is so large that you're not even able to see the ceiling of it, but seems to be built around this machine. There looks to be two levels in the room, a bottom level that the character is on and a top level that can be seen on the far right and left. There also seems to be different doors on the right side that the character might be able to go into. Might, if he's able to step over those pipes on the lower right side of the screen. Scorn Guy isn't exactly the most physically capable video game character out there. Now, what this thing does is unknown, or even what it is. It sort of looks like a heart, and I would say invokes a feeling of like some sort of reactor, like some nuclear device that powers everything, but that is all speculation. There is concept art of it, I think. It's rather odd since it excludes the context of the area it's in, just showing the machine itself, and in a very different way than what's actually in the trailer. Based on the heavy use of a cloudy green background and general green color palette, this concept art also seems like it was one of the earlier things drawn, rather than drawn specifically for the scenes in the trailer. So it's a pre-alpha day concept art. It's possible to see steam emanating from the machine, as well as from one of the holes on the top, some red substance leaking out of it. So while it does sort of further give off that heart-like vibe, it doesn't really tell us anything else. At least we can say it was Scorn guys who built this, given how haphazardly the pipework is laid out. I mean, really, that lower one is just digging straight into the ground, and there's no structure around it to secure it, or anything like that. It's like the room was built here initially, and then they wanted to build this device here, but they didn't plan for where the pipes would go to, so they had to just quickly dig out a hole in the ground and make a mess of everything. Another shot of Scorn guy closing his eyes, and then transitions to this meat tunnel closing. Though there's not much context to it, this is, I would say, the fullest environment we've seen so far in the trailer, other than the one Scorn guy walks into. It's also the fleshiest full environment we've seen, and one with a very clear purpose. It's a tunnel. It's a tunnel you have to close in order to get from one side of it to the other. Though the tunnel is clearly biological, it is possible to see some metal grid work surrounding it. It's likely there to keep the tunnel in place, perhaps keep it in the circular shape that it is rather than letting it collapse in on itself. On the sides of this tunnel are these yellow patches that I can only guess perhaps illuminates a tunnel, or perhaps are windows showing you something, but given the grid work on the outside, I kind of doubt the latter. In any case, there's no concept art for this tunnel here, it's just the shot in the trailer and nothing more. What's most likely is that during the game, we'll need to find a way to close the tunnel in order to access a different area, and there's a puzzle in relation to that. There's another shot of Scorn guy, much closer than before, and the camera zooms in on one of his eyes to transition into a first-person gameplay shot, where the character is walking through a tunnel laced with pipes and comes across this withering creature on the ground. The creature is obviously suffering, bleeding as it must have dragged itself to that position. The character takes out his gun and removes part of it. It's likely not that far off from the torso side shot from earlier in the trailer, as he still has no flesh and is using the same piece as before. He attaches a different piece to the gun, one we haven't seen before, and points it at this withering abomination. He doesn't fire, which is interesting. The creature just looks up, seems to cry out in agony, and then slumps back down to continue to slowly die. When this came out, it was a genuine question of whether or not this thing is supposed to be an enemy, or if your character is giving it a mercy kill. Nowadays, due to the gameplay trailer and the demo, we know this thing isn't our friend. We also know that in the demo and gameplay trailer, one of these will fall from the ceiling and sort of lay there groaning in agony in a similar manner to here. However, for it to be crawling to where it is, which evidently this creature did due to the streak of blood behind it, your character would have to shoot off one of its limbs. It's likely missing its back left leg based on where the blood trail is coming from. And since your character is approaching this thing, likely for the first time, though we don't know for certain, that would mean something else would have had to injure it, in which case, what? There is concept art for these things. They're called bears in the game files, which I have no idea what the hell is going on in Serbia, but anyways, what's interesting is there's actually two versions of this concept art. There's the one you see here, and there's also one where it's producing this red weed underneath its feet. And that seems to be the only difference between the two concept arts. I've said earlier that these creatures are what's responsible for all the biological waste that can be found in the gameplay trailer and the demo. There's another concept art showing these things forming a chain with their own bodies. You can see that the red growth is a lot more pronounced now. What I find kind of interesting is that these things, especially in this shot in the trailer, sort of resemble the initial concept arts for the chestburster that H.R. Giger drew for Alien. It's likely because of the rather bloated body and much thinner animal-like legs. We do get a final shot of the area Scorn guy was walking through, further cementing it as a place of importance, I would say, given just how much attention was given to this area alone. I actually really like this shot. The lighting, the fog, it creates a huge air of mystery that's just waiting to be solved. It's probably the most somber of all shots in the trailer. It also has some concept art, where the person who made it decided, you know what my favorite color is today? Green. Even though there is a bit of green in the shot from the trailer itself, it's certainly not as pronounced as this. Color palette aside, the biggest difference is that in the concept art, the door is open. The final shot, after that room is completely encased in fog, is the game's logo, a very bony looking thing with a few particles dripping down from it, followed then by shall we say, a rather incorrect release date, and also outdated information as the game is no longer split into parts. The logo itself has actually undergone its own evolution. In his ArtStation page, the artist Martin de Diego says this: "Logo design in process for Scorn.com I did early 2016. They wanted an O that would also work as independent symbol form, like an emblem for the game, but they wasn't sure exactly what they wanted, so I had to perform many variations. Now, having a specific part of the logo be the centerpiece is nothing new. Agony, for example, also uses the O as a centerpiece, with it closer resembling the maw of its onoskelus creature more than anything, and has actually been incorporated as traps in the game itself, or at least the unrated version. However, it doesn't seem like the Scorn devs have fallen through with the idea of the O being an independent symbol. In fact, if you look on their website, the icon accompanying it is the S. Not knowing the future, Diego started out working on the O, coming up with these rather sharp-looking designs for what it'll eventually be. The top one is not exactly too close, but a lot more similar to the final design than anything else he came up with. Still trying to figure out the O, he went through quite a few different designs. I would say the ones on the right look closer to something you would see in a sort of fantasy game than something you would find in Scorn. However, what's worth pointing out is that he already had an idea of what the other letters would be shaped like. One of the things he played around with was the centerpiece being this fetus creature. I don't know if it has any relevance to the game, or if he was just trying to come up with something weird and biological. It certainly wouldn't be any Scorn guys, since we know Scorn guys are grown from walls. He also played around with the texture of the letters. They still have very solid outlines, but on the inside there's a lot of bony and biological aspects to them now. Eventually he ditched the smooth outlines and allowed the whole thing to look deteriorated and bony, and you can see it pretty much looks like the final version with the exception of the O. He seemed to like the version that I pointed out was closest to the final product, and seemed to want to include some small symbol in the absolute center of it, sort of like an eye, the pupil for an eye or something like that. He continued to wrestle with what the O would be like. He colored in the other letters, giving it a more grayish metallic look than anything. Continuing on, he decided to eventually try to finalize it, and his idea for it was to have the logo surrounded by this very vivid green light. The second of these green light coated logos actually very closely resembles the final one. The pieces are in even length as opposed to what they look like in the final version, where one is a little bit longer than the other, and the breaks are straight north and south rather than at an angle, and there's some bit in the center of it, but still, he's pretty much figured it out by this point. It's quite something how different a logo can look at its inception and finalized version, isn't it? For the final version, he decided to add a little bit of yellow and green to the logo rather than just gray, and give it a more withered look than what he originally had. And you'd think that would be the end of it, but no. The logo isn't done changing yet. At some time around the period between June 6th and August 10th, that period because August 10th is when they accidentally uploaded this image of the more developed Scorn guy rather than the skull version, they decided to change the logos some more, giving it not only skin but also a little bit of red flesh on it as well. It's still shaped the same, it still has all the same sort of structures visible on it as on the bone version, but for whatever reason they decided to update this out of everything else. For the longest time, this trailer was the most information we had about Scorn and its world, and looking back at it with all the concept art that has been posted over time as well as the gameplay trailer and demo, it is interesting to see not only how things have changed since their inception into what we see in the trailer, but what we see in the trailer, what it actually ended up being. Hopefully sometime in the near future the developers give some more insights and context into the various imagery we've seen so far. I'd like to know more about the Fleshy exhaust. I'd like to know what's behind that door. I'd like to know how exactly the machines work, or what that giant structure we saw Scorn guy walking toward in a brief cut was. But until that day comes, we can only wait. And so until then, I hope you enjoyed the video, that I gave you something to think about and otherwise entertained you. Take care.